eyes, tumid mouth, teeth like nails, Father Casper said at once that it was a creature of Beelzebub. It should be left to suffocate on deck until death took it, then away with it, to whence it came. Did he declare this through acquired knowledge, or was he judging by the thing's appearance? In any case, all the fish Casper considered edible proved to be excellent, and, indeed, of one he was able to specify that it was better boiled than baked. Initiating Roberto into the mysteries of that Solomonic Sea, the Jesuit also became more precise in vouchsafing information about the island, which the Daphne, on arriving, had circumnavigated completely. Towards the east the island had some little beaches, but they were too exposed to the winds. Immediately after the southern promontory, where the crew had landed with the boat, there was a calm bay, but the water there was too shallow to moor the Daphne. This point, where the ship now lay, was the most suitable. Closer to the island, they would run aground, and farther away, they would find themselves right in a very strong current that ran through the channel between the two islands from southwest to northeast. It was easy to illustrate this to Roberto. Father Casper asked him to throw the carcass of Beelzebub's fish with all his strength into the sea to the west, and the corpse of the monster, while it could be seen floating, was violently yanked away by an invisible stream. Casper and the seamen had explored the island, if not entirely, enough to allow them to decide that one hill, chosen as site of the specula, was the best to command with the eye all that land, vast as the city of Rome. In the interior there was a waterfall, and splendid vegetation which included not only coconuts and bananas but also some trees with star-shaped trunks, the tips of the star as sharp as blades. As for the animals, some of which Roberto had seen on the lower deck, the island was a paradise of birds, and there were even flying foxes. The crew had sighted pigs in the underbrush but had not been able to capture them. There were serpents, but none had proved venomous or fierce, while the varieties of lizards were innumerable. But the richest fauna were found along the coral barbican: turtles, crabs, and oysters of every shape, difficult to compare with those found in our seas, big as baskets, as pots, as serving platters, often difficult to open, but once opened, revealing quantities of white flesh, soft and fat, and they were genuine delicacies. Unfortunately, they could not be brought on board ship. Once out of the water, they immediately spoiled in the sun's heat. They had seen none of the great ferocious animals in which other Asian countries are so rich, no elephants or tigers or crocodiles. Or, for that matter, anything that resembled an ox, a bull, a horse, or a dog. It appeared that in this land every form of life had been conceived not by an architect or a sculptor but by a jeweler. The birds were colored crystal, the woodland animals were delicate, the fish flat and almost transparent. It had not seemed to Father Casper or to the captain or the sailors that in those waters there were dogfish, easily recognized even from a distance thanks to that fin keen as an axe. And yet in those seas they are found everywhere. The idea that there were no sharks around the island was, in my opinion, an illusion of that inspired explorer. But perhaps what he argued was true, namely that, as slightly to the west there was a great current, those animals preferred to dwell there, where they were sure of finding more plentiful sustenance. However it may have been, it is well for the story that follows that neither Casper nor Roberto feared the presence of sharks, otherwise they would not have had the heart to go down into the water, and I would have no tale to tell. As Roberto listened, he became more and more captivated by the distant island. He tried to imagine its shape, its color, the movement of the creatures Father Casper described. And the corals? What were these corals, which he knew only as jewels that according to poets had the color of a beautiful woman's lips? Regarding corals Father Casper remained speechless. He merely raised his eyes to heaven with an expression of bliss. The corals of which Roberto spoke were dead corals, like the virtue of the courtesans for whom libertines employed that trite simile. On the reef, too, there were dead corals, and it was they that wounded anyone touching them. But they were nothing compared to living corals, which were, how to describe them? Submarine flowers, anemone, hyacinth, ranunculus, gillyflowers. No, that gave no idea. They were a festival of galls, curls, berries, bowls, burrs, shoots, hearts, twigs. No, they were something else. Mobile, colorful as Armida's veil, and they imitated all the vegetables of field, garden, wood, from cucumber to mushroom, even the frilled cabbage. He had seen them elsewhere, thanks to an instrument constructed by a fellow Jesuit, and after some rummaging in his chest, he produced the instrument. It was a kind of leather mask with a great glass eyepiece, the upper orifice edged and reinforced. Thanks to a pair of strings it could be bound at the nape, making the mask adhere to the face from brow to chin. In a flat-bottomed boat, which would not run aground on submerged sandbars, he had been able to lower his face until it was in the water, allowing him to see the bottom, whereas if he had immersed his bare head, there would have been only stinging of the eyes and he would have seen nothing. Casper thought that the device, which he called a perspiculum, eyeglass, or persona vitrea, a mask that does not hide but, rather, reveals, could be worn also by someone who knew how to swim among rocks. Sooner or later, the water did penetrate to the inside, but for a little while, holding your breath, you could continue observing. After which, the swimmer would have to emerge, empty the receptacle, and begin again. If you to swim would learn, you could these things see down there, Casper said to Roberto. And Roberto, mocking him, replied, if I swum, my chest would a keg become. And yet he reproached himself for his inability to go down there. But at the same time, Father Casper was adding, on the island there was the flame dove. Flame dove? What is that? Roberto asked, and the eagerness in his question seems to us excessive. As if the island for some time had promised him an obscure emblem, which only now had become radiant. Father Casper explained how hard it was to describe the beauty of this bird. You had to see it before you could talk about it. The very day of his arrival, he had glimpsed it through his spyglass. From a distance it was like seeing a fiery sphere of gold, or of gilded fire, which from the top of the tallest tree shot up towards the sky. Once he was on land, he wanted to learn more, and he taught the sailors to identify it. It was quite a long ambush until they came to understand in which trees the bird lived. It emitted a very special sound, a sort of talk-talk, such as we can make by striking the tongue against the palate. Casper found that if he imitated this call with his mouth or fingers, the bird would respond and, once in a while, let itself be described as it flew from one bough to another. Casper returned several times, to lie in wait, but with a glass, and at least once he saw the bird clearly, almost immobile. The head was a dark olive color. No, perhaps an asparagus green, like the feet, and the beak, the color of lucerne, extended like a mask to frame the eye, which was like a kernel of maize, the pupil a glistening black. It had a short bib, gold like its wingtips, but the body from breast to tail, where the feathers were fine as a woman's hair, was, what? Red? No, that was the wrong word. Ruddy, ruby, rubescent, rubidinous, rubent, rubefacient, Roberto suggested. Neen. Father Casper became irritated. Roberto went on. Like a strawberry, a geranium, a raspberry, a cherry, a radish. Like hollyberries, the belly of a thrush, the wing of a redwing, the tail of a redstart, the breast of a robin. No, Father Casper insisted, struggling with his own and other languages to find the proper words. Judging by the synthesis Roberto makes later, and it is hard to tell whether the vehemence is more in the informant or in the informed. It must have been the festive color of a Seville orange. It was a winged sun, in other words. When seen against the white sky it was as if the dawn had flung a pomegranate on the snow. And when it catapulted into the sun, it was more dazzling than a cherub. That orange-colored bird, Father Casper said, could live only on the island of Solomon, because it was in the song of that great king that a dove was spoken of, rising like the dawn, bright as the sun, terribilis ud castrorum acies ordinata. It had, as another psalm says, wings covered with silver and feathers with glints of gold. Along with this animal, Casper had seen another almost its equal, except that its feathers were not orange but greenish, and from the way the two were normally seen paired on the same branch, they must have been male and female. That they were doves was obvious from their shape and frequently heard cry. Which of the two was the male was hard to say. In any case Casper had ordered the sailors not to kill them. Roberto asked how many doves there could be on the island. All Father Casper knew was that each time he had seen only one orange ball dart towards the clouds, and only one couple among the high fronds. So on the island there might be just 2 doves, and just one orange-colored. A supposition that made Roberto crave that rare beauty, which, if it was now awaiting him, had always been awaiting him since the day before. For that matter, if Roberto chose, Casper said, he could remain for hours and hours at the spyglass and see it also from the ship. Provided he removed those smoked spectacles. When Roberto replied that his eyes did not allow him to, Casper made some scornful remarks about that milksop's ailment, and prescribed the liquids with which he had treated his bubo, spiritus, alia, floris. It is not clear whether or not Roberto tried them, or if he gradually trained himself to look without the glasses, first at dawn and sunset and then in broad day, and we cannot say if he was still wearing them when, as we shall see, he tried to learn to swim. But the fact is that from this moment on his eyes are no longer mentioned to justify any sort of flight or absence. So we may assume that gradually, perhaps through the therapeutic action of that balmy air or that seawater, Roberto was cured of a complaint that, real or imagined, had turned him into a lycanthrope for more than 10 months, unless the reader chooses to insinuate that because from now on I need him on deck full-time, and finding no contradiction among his papers, I am freeing him from all illness, with authorial arrogance. But perhaps Roberto wanted to be healed, at all costs, in order to see the dove. And he would have flung himself on the bulwarks and spent the day peering at the trees, if he had not been distracted by another unresolved question. Having ended his description of the island and its riches, Father Casper remarked that all these delights could be found nowhere save on the antipodal meridian. Roberto then asked, "Reverend Father, you told me that the Specula Melitensis confirmed that you were on the antipodal meridian, and I believe it. Still, you did not stop and set up the specula on every island you encountered on your voyage, but only on this one. So somehow, before the specula told you, you must already have been sure you would find the longitude you were seeking. You think very right. If I here were come without knowing here was here, I could not know I was here. Now I explain you. Since I knew that the specula was the only correct instrument to arrive where to try out the specula, I had to use false methods. So I did. Chapter 23. Divers and Artificious Machines. As Roberto, incredulous, demanded to know what, and how useless, the various methods to find longitudes had been, Father Casper replied that while all were erroneous when taken one by one, if taken together the various results could achieve a balance and compensate for the individual defects, and this est mathematical. To be sure, A clock after traveling thousands of miles could no longer tell accurately the time of its place of origin. But how many and various clocks, some of special and careful construction, had Roberto seen on board the Daphne? You compare their inexact times, study daily the responses of one against the assertions of the others, and you arrive at a kind of certitude. What of the lock or the navicella, or whatever you choose to call it? The usual ones do not work, but here is what Father Casper had constructed. A box with two vertical poles, one that wound as the other unwound a cord of fixed length equivalent to a fixed number of miles, and the winding pole was surmounted by many little blades, which as in a mill turned under the force of the same winds that swelled the sails. Their movement accelerated or slowed, and therefore wound or unwound the cord, according to the strength and direction, straight or oblique, of the wind, recording meanwhile also the deviations due to tacking, or sailing against the wind. A method not much more sure than all the others, but excellent if someone compared its results with those of other soundings. Lunar eclipses? To be sure, observing them during a voyage resulted in endless misunderstandings. But what about those observed on land? We must have many observers and in many places of the world, and well disposed to collaborate in the major glory of God, and not exchange insults or spitefulness or scorn. Listen. In 1612, the 8th of November, at Macau, the Most Reverend Pater Julius de Alessis records an eclipse at 8:30 that evening until 11:30. He informs the Most Reverend Pater Carolus Spinola, who at Nagasaki, in Ioponia, the same eclipse at 9:30 of the same evening was observing. And the Pater Christophorus Schneider had the same eclipse seen at Ingolstadt at 5 in the afternoon. The differentia of 1 hora makes 15 degrees of meridian, and therefore this is the distance between Macau and Nagasaki, not 16 degrees and 20, as says Blaeu. Verstanden? Naturally with these records you must guard against drink and smoke, have correct horology, not lose the inidium totalis immersionis, and maintain correct medium between inidium and finis eclipsis, observe the intermediary moments in which the spots are dark, etc. If the places are distant, a very little error makes no gross differentia, but if the places are proximi, an error of a few minutes makes gross differentia. Apart from the fact that in the matter of Macau and Nagasaki it seems to me that Blaeu is closer to the truth than Father Casper, which proves how complicated longitudes were at that time. This is how the Jesuits, after collecting and collating the observations of their missionary brethren, established a Horologium Catholicum, which, despite the name, was not a clock devoted to the Roman Pope but a universal clock. It was in effect a kind of planisphere on which were marked all the headquarters of the society, from Rome to the borders of the known world, and for each place the local time was marked. Thus, Father Casper explained, he had not had to bear in mind the hour at the beginning of the voyage but only at the last outpost of the Christian world, whose longitude was beyond debate. Then the margins for error were greatly reduced, and between one station and the next they could also use methods that, in the absolute sense, offered no guarantee, such as the variation of the needle or calculation from lunar spots. Fortunately he had brethren just about everywhere, from Pernambuco to Goa, from Mindanao to Porto Sancti Tome, and if winds prevented the Daphne from mooring in one port, there would soon be another. For example, at Macau. Macau. At the very thought of that adventure, Father Casper glowered. It was a Portuguese possession. The Chinese called the Europeans men of long noses precisely because the first to land on their shores were the Portuguese, who truly do have long noses, and also the Jesuits, who came with them. So the city was a single garland of blue and white fortresses on the hill, controlled by the fathers of the society, who had to concern themselves also with military matters, since the city was threatened by the Dutch heretics. Father Casper had decided to head for Macau, where he knew a fellow Jesuit very learned in the astronomical sciences, but he had forgotten that he was sailing on a flute. What did the good fathers of Macau do? Sighting a Dutch ship, they manned their cannons and colubrins. In vain Father Casper waved his arms at the prow and immediately had the society's standard run up. Those cursed long noses, his Portuguese brothers in the society, wrapped in the warrior smoke that invited them to a holy massacre, did not even notice, and they rained balls around the Daphne. It was the pure grace of God that the ship was barely able to strike its sails, come about, and escape to sea while the captain in his Lutheran language hurled anathema at those fathers of scant consideration. And this time he was right. Sinking the Dutch is all very well, but not when there is a Jesuit on board. Luckily it was fairly easy to reach other missions not far away, and they turned their bowsprit towards the more hospitable Mindanao. And so, from one port to the next, they kept watch over their longitude, and God help them, I add, considering that, having ended up practically in Australia, they must have lost track of every point of reference. Et hora we must novissima experimenta make, ut clarissima et evidenter demonstrate that we are on meridian 180. Otherwise the freighters of the Collegium Romanum will think I am a Mameluke. New experiments? Roberto asked. Did you not just tell me that the specula gave you the utmost assurance of being on the 180th meridian, off the island of Solomon? Yes, the Jesuit replied, he was certain. He had set in competition the various imperfect methods found by others, and the accord of all these weak methods supplied a very strong certitude, as happens in the proof of God's existence by consensus gentium, for while it is true that many men inclined to err also believe in God, it is impossible that all should be mistaken, from the forests of Africa to the deserts of China. So it happens that we believe in the movement of the sun and the moon and of the other planets, or in the hidden power of chelidonium, or that at the center of the earth there is a fire. For thousands and thousands of years men have believed these things, and while believing them, they have been able to live on this planet and achieve many useful results from their reading of the great book of nature. But an important discovery like this had to be confirmed by further proof, so that even the skeptics would surrender to the evidence. Besides, science must be pursued not only for the love of learning but in the desire to share it with our brothers. So, since it had cost him such an effort to find the correct longitude, he now had to seek confirmation through other, easier methods, so that this knowledge could become the patrimony of all our brothers, or at least of the Christian ones, or, rather, the Catholic brothers, because, as for the Dutch or English heretics, or worse, the Moravians, it would be far better if they never came to learn of these secrets. Now, of all the methods of taking longitude, two seemed sure to him. 1. Good for terra firma, was that treasure of all methods, namely the specula melitensis. The other, appropriate for observation at sea, was the instrumentum arcetricum, which lay below but had not yet been set up, because he first had to obtain through the specula the certitude of their position, then see if the instrumentum confirmed it, which was the most reliable way to proceed. Father Casper would have carried out this experiment long before if what happened had not happened. But the moment now had come, and it would be on that very night. The sky and the ephemerides said that now was the right occasion. What was the instrumentum arcetricum? A device envisioned many years earlier by Galilei, but, mind you, envisioned, narrated, promised, never achieved, until Father Casper set to work. When Roberto asked him if that Galilei was the same who had advanced a severely condemned hypothesis about the motion of the earth, Father Casper replied yes. When that Galilei had stuck his nose into metaphysics and the sacred scriptures, he had said dreadful things, but as a mechanical he was a man of genius and very great. Asked whether it was not wrong to use the ideas of a man the church had censured, the Jesuit answered that to the greater glory of God the ideas of a heretic also could contribute, provided they in themselves were not heretical. And we might have known that Father Casper, who welcomed all existing methods, not swearing by any one of them but exploiting their quarrelsome conference, would exploit also the method of Galilei. Indeed, it was highly useful both for science and for the faith to develop as soon as possible that idea of Galilei. The Florentine himself had tried to sell it to the Dutch, but fortunately, like the Spaniards a few decades earlier, they did not trust him. Galilei had drawn some odd conclusions from a premise that in itself was quite right, namely that of stealing the idea of the spyglass from the Flemings, who used it only to look at ships in port, and training that instrument on the heavens. And there, among the many things that Father Casper would not dream of doubting, Galilei had discovered that Jupiter, or Jove, as he called it, had 4 satellites, that is to say 4 moons, never seen from the beginning of the world until that moment. 4 little stars that revolved around it while it revolved around the sun, and we will see that for Father Casper the idea that Jove revolved around the sun was admissible, provided the earth was left alone. Now, it is a well-known fact that our moon, when it passes in the shadow of the earth, is eclipsed. Astronomers have long known when lunar eclipses would occur, and the ephemerides were authoritative. It was not surprising, then, that the moons of Jove also had their eclipses. Indeed, for us at least, they had 2, one actual eclipse and one occultation. In fact, the moon disappears from our sight when the earth comes between it and the sun, but the satellites of Jove disappear from our sight twice, when they pass behind it and when they pass in front, becoming united with its light. Through a good spyglass you can easily follow their appearances and their disappearances. With the inestimable advantage that while the eclipses of the moon occur only very rarely and take a long time, those of the Jovian satellites occur frequently and are rapid. Now let us suppose that the hour and the minutes of the eclipses of each satellite, each traveling in an orbit of different breadth, have been precisely established on a known meridian, and the ephemerides bear this out, at which point it is enough to be able to fix the hour and the minute when the eclipse is visible on the unknown meridian, and the calculation is quickly made, and the longitude of the point of observation can be deduced. True, there were minor drawbacks, not worth discussing with a layman, but the enterprise would succeed for a good calculator who had at his disposal a measure of time, namely a perpendiculum or pendulum, or a horologium oscillatorium as might be, capable of measuring with absolute precision even to the second. Similarly, he would need 2 normal clocks that told him faithfully the hour of the beginning and the end of the phenomenon both on the meridian of observation and on that of the Isla de Hierro. And, using the table of sines, he could measure the quantity of the angle made in the eye by the bodies under examination, the angle that, if thought of as the hands of a clock, expressed in minutes and seconds the distance between the 2 bodies and its progressive variation. Provided, it is well to repeat, he also had those good ephemerides that Galilei, by then old and infirm, had not been able to complete, but that the brethren of Father Casper, already so good at calculating eclipses of the moon, had now perfected. What were the chief flaws, over which Galilei's adversaries had waxed so bitter? That these observations could not be made with the naked eye and the observer needed a strong spyglass, or telescope, as it was now more properly called? And Father Casper had some of excellent facture such as not even Galilei had dreamed of. That the measuring and the calculating were not within the skill of sailors? Why, all the other methods for determining longitude, except perhaps the log, required the presence of an astronomer. And if captains had learned to use the astrolabe, which itself was not something within the grasp of any layman, they could also learn to use the glass. But, the pedants said, such exact observations requiring great precision could perhaps be made on land, but not on a ship in motion, where no one could hold a glass fixed on a celestial body invisible to the naked eye. Well, Father Casper was here to demonstrate that, with a bit of skill, observations could be made also on a moving ship. Finally, some Spaniards had objected that satellites in eclipse did not appear during the day nor on stormy nights. Perhaps these complainers believed that a man claps his hands and there, illico et immediate, lunar eclipses are at his disposal. Father Casper was irritated. Who ever said that observations had to be made at every instant? Anyone who has voyaged from one Indies to the other knows that taking the longitude cannot require a greater frequency than what is required for observing the latitude, and this, too, whether with astrolabe or Jacob's cross, cannot be done in moments of great tumult of the sea. To measure it properly, this longitude, even only once every 2 or 3 days suffices. Then, between one observation and the next it is possible to keep account of the time and the space covered, as was done in the past, using the astrolabe. But until now that was all they could use for months and months. They seem to me, the good father said, more indignant than ever, like Womo that in gross famine you assist with a basket of bread, and instead of saying Gratia he is disturbed that also a roasted schweine or a fat rabbit you do not put on the table for him. Oh, holy wood, would you perhaps throw into the sea the cannons of this ship only because, 90 times out of 100, the balls fall plop into the aqua? So then Father Casper engaged Roberto in the preparation of an experiment that was to be performed on an evening like the one now ahead of them, astronomically opportune, with clear sky and with the sea in slight motion. If the experiment were done on an evening of calm, Father Casper explained, it would be like doing it on land, and there, as was already known, it was bound to succeed. The experiment had to provide the observer with the semblance of calm on a hull moving from stern to prow and from side to side. First of all they had to recover, from among the clocks so maltreated over the past few days, one still in proper working order. Only one, in this fortunate case, and not two, they would set it to the local hour after taking good diurnal bearings. Which they did, and, as they were certain of being on the antipodal meridian, there was no reason to have another clock telling the time of the Isla de Hierro. It was enough to know that the difference was exactly 12 hours. Midnight here, noon there. On sober reflection, however, this decision seems based on a vicious circle. Their position on the antipodal meridian was something the experiment was to prove, not something to take as a given. But Father Casper was so sure of his previous observations that he desired only to confirm them, and then, probably, after all the confusion on the ship there was no longer a single clock that still told the time at the other side of the globe, and they had to overcome that obstacle. Actually, Roberto was not so punctilious as to point out the flaw in this argument. When I say go, you look at the hour and write. And immediately strike the perpendiculum. The perpendiculum was supported by a little metal armature which acted as a gallows for a copper wand ending in a circular pendulum. At the lowest point of the pendulum's course there was a horizontal wheel in which teeth were set, but shaped so that one side of the tooth was square and jetted above the level of the wheel, and the other oblique. Alternately moving in this direction and that, the pendulum struck with a protruding spike, a bristle, which in turn touched a tooth on its jetted side and moved the wheel. But when the pendulum returned, the little bristle just grazed the oblique side of the tooth, and the wheel remained still. If the teeth were numbered, it was possible, when the pendulum stopped, to count the number of teeth shifted, and thus calculate the number of particles of time that had passed. So you are not obliged to count every time 1, 2, 3, etc., but in the end when I say suffocate, you stop the perpendiculum and count the teeth, verstanden? And write how many teeth. Then you look at the horologium and write this or that hora. And when I again say go, you a very strong push give it, and it begins again its oscillatio. Simple, even a parvulus can do. To be sure, this was not a great perpendiculum, as Father Casper well knew, but debate on that mechanism was just beginning, and only at some future time would it be possible to construct perfected ones. Very difficult, and we must yet much learn, but if God did not forbid die wet, how do you say? The peri. Betting. Ah. If God did not forbid, I would bet that in the future all will go to seek longitudes and all other phenomena with the perpendiculum. But is very difficult on a ship, and you must make gross attention. Casper told Roberto to arrange the devices, together with writing materials, on the quarterdeck, which was the highest observation point on the Daphne. There they would set up the instrumentum arcetricum. From the soda they had carried up the instruments Roberto had glimpsed while he was still pursuing the intruder. These were easily transported, except for the metal basin, which the two men hoisted up on the deck with curses and ruinous failures, for it would not pass through the hatches. But Father Casper, wiry as he was, now that he saw the imminent realization of his plan, revealed a physical energy equal to his will. Almost alone, with an implement of his that tightened bolts, he mounted the armature of semicircles and little bars of iron, which turned out to be a round frame, and to this a circular canvas was fixed with some rings, so that in the end they had a kind of great basin in the form of half a spherical orb with a diameter of about 2 meters. It was necessary to tar it so it would retain the malodorous oil with which Roberto filled it, emptying keg after keg, complaining of the stench. Father Casper reminded him, seraphic as a Capuchin, that they were not using the oil to fry onions. What is the use of it, then? On this little sea we try an even more little vessel to put, he said, and made Roberto help him place in the great canvas basin a metallic pan, almost flat, with a diameter only slightly less than that of its container. You never heard say the sea smooth like oil? There, look, the deck tilts left and oil of the big basin tilts right, and vice versa, or, rather, so to you it seems. Truly the oil in equilibrium stays, never up or down, and to the horizon parallel. It would happen also with water, but on oil the pan floats like on a calm sea. And I have already in Rome a little experiment done, with 2 little bowls, the bigger full of water and the little of sand, and in the sand I stuck a stylus, and I set the little afloat in the big, and I moved the big, and you could see the stylus erect like campanile, not bent like the towers of Bologna. Wunderbar. Xenoglod Roberto cried approvingly. And now, Hora, we take the pan, where we must in it a whole machine put. The bottom of the metal pan had some little springs on the outside so that, the Jesuit explained, once it was afloat with its cargo in the larger tub, it would remain separated by at least 1 finger from the bottom of the container. And if the excessive movement of its guest drove it too far down, what guest? Roberto asked. Now you will see, Caspar replied. Those springs should cause it to rise to the surface again without shocks. To the inner pan they affixed a seat with a sloping back, which allowed a man to sit or, rather, recline, looking up, his feet on an iron bar that acted as a counterweight. Having set up the basin on the deck, and having made it stable with some wedges, Father Caspar sat on the seat and explained to Roberto how to place on his back and fasten to his waist a harness of straps and bandoliers of canvas and leather, to which also a helmet with a visor should be tied. The visor had a hole for one eye, while at the level of the nose a rod protruded, surmounted by a small hoop. Through the hoop was inserted the spyglass, from which a little staff hung, ending in a hook. The hyperbole of the eyes could be moved freely until a given star was identified, but, once the star was in the center of the lens, the rigid staff was fixed to the pectoral bandoliers, and after that a steady view was assured, fixed against any possible movements of that cyclops. Perfecto. The Jesuit rejoiced. When the pan was set afloat on the becalmed oil, even the most elusive celestial bodies could be steadied and no commotion of the sea and tumult could cause the horoscope and eye to be deflected from the chosen star. This your Signor Galilei described, and I have made. Very beautiful, Roberto said, but who will put all this in the tub of oil? Now I untie myself and get down, then we put the empty pan in the oil, then I climb on again. I cannot believe that will be easy. Much more easier than moving the pan with me in it seated. Though with some effort, the pan with its chair was hoisted up and set afloat on the oil. Then Father Caspar, in helmet and harness, and the spyglass mounted on the visor, tried to climb onto the scaffolding while Roberto held him, one hand clutching his hand and the other pushing his bottom. The attempt was repeated several times, but with no success. It was not that the metal frame supporting the larger tub could not support also an occupant, but it denied him reasonable footholds. And if Father Caspar tried, as he did many times, to set only 1 foot on the rim, immediately placing the other inside the minor circle, this latter, in the disturbance of the embarkation, tended to glide over the oil towards the opposite side of the basin, making the priest's legs part like a compass as he emitted cries of alarm until Roberto seized him by the waist and drew him closer, that is to say onto the relative terra firma of the Daphne, cursing meanwhile the memory of Galilei and extolling his persecutors and killers. At that point Father Caspar sank into the arms of his Savior, assuring him with a groan that those persecutors were not killers but most worthy men of the Church, bent only on the preservation of the truth, and that with Galilei they had been paternal and merciful. Then, still cuirassed and immobilized, his gaze towards the sky and the spyglass perpendicular to his face, like a Pulcinella with a mechanical nose, he reminded Roberto that Galilei, at least with this invention, had not erred, and it was just a matter of trying and trying again. Un so mein lieber Robertus, he then said, perhaps you have me forgotten and believe me a tortoise, captured with belly open? Come, push me again, there, help me touch that rim, there now, for man is proper the statura erecta. Through these several unhappy operations the oil did not remain smooth as oil, and after a while both experimenters found themselves oleate and, what was worse, oleabund, if the context allows the chronicler this coinage without imputation of the source. When Father Caspar had begun to despair of ever occupying that seat, Roberto observed that perhaps it was necessary first to empty the container of oil, then install the pan, then have the priest climb onto it, and finally pour in the oil again, which, as its level rose, would raise also the pan and, with it, the observer, all floating together. So it was done, amid praise from the master lavished on his acute pupil, as midnight was approaching. Not that the apparatus gave a great impression of stability, but if Father Caspar took care not to move unduly, they could hope. At a certain moment Father Caspar triumphed. I see them. The cry caused him to move his nose, and the glass, rather heavy, began to slip out of the circle. He moved his arm to arrest it. The movement of the arm jerked his shoulder, and the pan was on the point of capsizing. Roberto abandoned paper and clocks, supported Caspar, re-established the equilibrium of the whole and bade the astronomer remain motionless, allowing only his eyepiece to make very prudent shifts, and above all without expressing emotions. The next announcement was made in a whisper which, magnified by the great visor, seemed to resound as hoarse as a Tartar trumpet. I see them again, and with a measured gesture he fixed the spyglass to the pectoral. Oh, wunderbar. 3 little stars east of Jupiter, 1 alone west. The closest seems smallest and is. Wait. Yes, at 0 minutes and 30 seconds from Jupiter. Right, now it is about to touch Jupiter, soon it will disappear. Careful and write exactly the time it disappears. Roberto, who had left his place to assist his master, again picked up the tablet on which he was to mark the times, but sitting, he had the clocks behind him. He turned abruptly, knocking over the pendulum. The wand slipped from its notch.
Roberto seized it and tried to replace it, but he failed.
Father Casper was already shouting orders to note the time. Roberto turned towards the clock and, in moving, he struck the inkwell with his pen. Not thinking, he set the well upright, to save some of the liquid, but he knocked over the clock. Did you take the hour? Go. The perpendiculum. Casper was shouting, and Roberto replied, I cannot, I cannot. How can you not, dumbhead? And hearing no reply, he kept on shouting, how can you not, foolish? Have you written, have you made note, did you push? It is disappearing. Go. I have lost, no, not lost, I have broken everything, Roberto said. Father Casper moved the spyglass away from the visor, peered sideways, saw the pendulum in pieces, the clock overturned, Roberto's hands stained with ink. Beside himself, he exploded with a Himmelpotzblitz Herrgottssakrament that shook his whole body. In that unfortunate movement, he caused the pan to tilt too far, and he slid into the oil of the basin, the spyglass slipping from his hand in his hauberk. Then, as the ship pitched, the glass rolled across the quarterdeck, bounced down the ladder, and struck the main deck before it was flung against the breech of a cannon. Roberto did not know whether to succor first the man or the instrument. The man, flailing in that rancidity, shouted magnanimously to save the spyglass. Roberto rushed down to the elusive hyperbole, and found it, dented, both lenses broken. When Roberto finally removed Father Casper from the oil, the Jesuit, who looked like a piglet ready for the oven, simply said with heroic stubbornness that not all was lost. There was another telescope, equally powerful, mounted on the Specula Melitensis. They had only to go and fetch it from the island. How? Roberto asked. By natation. But you told me you cannot swim, nor should you, at your age. No. You, yes. But I do not know how to swim either. Learn. Chapter 24. Dialogues of the Maximum Systems. What follows is of uncertain nature. I am not sure if it is a chronicle of dialogues that occurred between Roberto and Father Casper, or if it is a series of notes that the former took at night to rebut the latter the following day. In any case, it is obvious that for all the time he remained on board with the old man, Roberto wrote no letters to the lady. And similarly, from his nocturnal existence he was moving, little by little, to a diurnal one. For example, until now he had looked at the island early in the morning, and then for only very brief periods, or else at evening, when the outlines and distances lost definition. But now at last he saw that the flux and reflux, the play of the tides, which for a part of the day brought the waters to lap the strip of sand that separated them from the forest and for the rest of the day made them withdraw, revealed a rocky expanse that, as Father Casper explained, was the last outcrop of the coral reef. Between the flux, or the afflux, and the reflux, his companion explained, about 6 hours go by, for such is the rhythm of the sea's respiration under the influence of the moon. Not as some had believed in ancient times, attributing this movement of the waters to the breathing of a monster of the deep, to say nothing of that French gentleman who declared that even if the earth does not move from west to east, it still pitches, so to speak, from north to south and vice versa, and in this periodic pitching it is natural that the sea should rise and fall, as when one shrugs and his cassock moves up and down his neck. Mysterious, this problem of the tides, because they vary according to the lands and the seas, and the position of the shores varies with respect to the meridians. As a general rule during the new moon, the high water comes at midday and midnight, but then the phenomenon is later each day by 4/5 of an hour, and the man who does not know this, seeing that at such and such an hour of such and such a day a certain channel is navigable, ventures into it at the same hour the next day and runs aground. Not to mention the currents that the tides provoke, and some of them are such that at the moment of reflux a ship cannot make it to shore. And further, the old man said, for whatever place you may be in, a different calculation is necessary, and astronomical tables are required. He tried, indeed, to explain to Roberto those calculations, that is, how you must observe the delay of the moon, multiplying the days of the moon by 4 and then dividing by 5, or else the reverse. The fact is that Roberto understood none of it, and we shall see later how this slackness of his led to serious trouble. He confined himself merely to being amazed each time the meridian line, which should have run from one end of the island to the other, sometimes passed through the sea, sometimes through the rocks, and he never knew which was the right moment. Also because, flux or reflux as the case might be, the great mystery of the tides mattered far less to him than the great mystery of that line, beyond which time went backwards. We have said that he had no particular inclination not to believe what the Jesuit was telling him. But often he enjoyed provoking him to make him say more, and then Roberto would resort to the whole repertory of argumentation he had picked up in the gatherings of those fine gentlemen that the Jesuits considered if not emissaries of Satan, at least toppers and debauchees who had made the tavern their lyceum. Finally, though, it became hard for Roberto to reject the physics of a master who, adhering to the principles of that same physics, was teaching him how to swim. His first reaction, with his shipwreck still impressed on his mind, was to declare that nothing on earth could induce him to resume contact with the water. Father Casper pointed out that during that same wreck, it was the water that had supported him, a sign therefore that it was an affectionate and not a hostile element. Roberto replied that the water had supported not him but the plank to which he had been bound, and it was then easy for Father Casper to point out to him that if the water had borne a piece of wood, an entity without a soul, tending to the abyss as anyone knows who has thrown a stick from a height, all the more was water suited, then, to bear a living being disposed to enhance the natural tendency of liquids. Roberto should know, if he had ever flung the dog into the water, that the animal, moving its paws, not only remained afloat but quickly returned to shore. And, Casper added, perhaps Roberto did not know that if infants barely a few months old were put into water, they were able to swim, for nature has made us swimmers like every animal. Unfortunately, of all animals, we are the most inclined to prejudice and error, and therefore, as we grow up, we acquire false notions as to the virtues of liquids, and thus fear and mistrust cause us to lose our inherent gift. Roberto then asked if he, the Reverend Father, had learned to swim, and the Reverend Father replied that he did not claim to be better than many others who had shunned good things. He had been born in a town very distant from the sea, and he had set foot on a ship only at an advanced age, when, he said, his body was nothing but a withering of the cutis, a dimming of the sight, a bestnodding of the nose, a whispering of the ears, a yellowing of the teeth, a stiffening of the spine, a waddling of the throat, a gouting of the heels, a spotting of the complexion, a whitening of the locks, a creaking of the tibias, a trembling of the fingers, a stumbling of the feet, and his breast was all one purging of catarrhs amid the coughing of phlegm and the spitting of sputum. But, as he quickly clarified, his mind being keener than his carcass, he knew what the sages of Greece had long since discovered, namely, that if you immerge a body in a liquid, this body receives support and impulse upwards, through all the water it displaces, as water seeks to reoccupy the space from which it has been exiled. And it is not true that this body floats or does not according to its form, and the ancients were mistaken in saying that a flat thing stays up and a pointed thing sinks. If Roberto were to try to thrust something by force into water, say, a bottle, which is not flat, he would perceive the same resistance as if he had tried to thrust a tray. It was a question therefore of acquiring familiarity with the element, whereupon everything would take its course. And he proposed that Roberto lower himself along the rope ladder hanging from the prow, known also as Jacob's ladder, but for his own serenity he should remain tied to a rope, or hawser, or cord as might be, long and sturdy, bound fast to the bulwarks. Then if he became afraid of drowning, he had only to pull the rope. It is hardly necessary to say that this master of an art he had never practiced had not taken into consideration an infinity of concomitant accidents, ignored also by the wise men of ancient Greece. For example, to allow Roberto freedom of movement, Casper supplied him with a rope of notable length, and at the first trial, like every aspirant swimmer, Roberto ended up below the surface of the water, then had difficulty pulling, and before the halyard drew him out, he had already swallowed enough salt water to make him want to renounce, on that first day, any further attempt. But this was, all the same, an encouraging start. Having descended the ladder and barely touched the water, Roberto realized that the liquid was pleasant. Of the wreck he had a chill and violent memory, and the discovery of a tepid sea invited him to proceed further with the immersion until, never letting go of the ladder, he allowed the water to reach his chin. In the belief that this was swimming, he then wallowed there, abandoning himself to memories of Parisian luxury. Since his landing on the ship he had performed, as we have seen, some ablutions, like a kitten licking its fur, but dealing only with face and pudenda. For the rest, and as he grew increasingly obsessed with his hunt for the intruder, his feet became smeared with the dregs of the hold, and sweat glued his clothes to his body. Upon contact with this tepor that washed his body together with his clothing, Roberto remembered the time he discovered, in the Palais Rambouillet, 2 separate tubs for the use of the marquise, whose concern for the care of her body provided a subject of conversation in a society where washing was not frequent. Indeed, the most refined of her guests believed that cleanliness consisted not in the use of water but in the freshness of one's linen, which it was a sign of elegance to change often. And the many scented essences with which the marquise stunned them were not a luxury but, rather, for her, a necessity, a defense erected between her sensitive nostrils and their greasy odors. Feeling himself more a gentleman than he had been in Paris, Roberto, clinging to the ladder with one hand, with the other rubbed shirt and trousers against his dirty body, while scratching the heel of one foot with the toes of the other. Father Casper observed him with curiosity but remained silent, wanting Roberto to make friends with the sea. Still, fearing that Roberto's mind might stray in this excessive concern for his body, the Jesuit tried to distract him. He talked to him of the tides and the attractive powers of the moon. He tried to make Roberto appreciate a proposition that had something incredible about it. If the tides respond to the summons of the moon, they should be present when the moon is present, and absent when the moon is on the other side of our planet. But, quite to the contrary, flux and reflux continue on both parts of the globe, as if pursuing each other every 6 hours. Roberto lent an ear to this talk, but he was thinking more about the moon, as he had done all those past nights, than about the tides. He asked how it is that we see always only one face of the moon, and Father Casper explained that it turns like a ball held on a string by an athlete who makes it revolve, but who can see nothing but the side towards himself. But, Roberto rebutted, this face is seen both by the Indians and the Spaniards, whereas on the moon the same thing is not true with respect to their moon, which some call vulva and which is our earth. The Cisvolvians, who live on the face turned towards us, see the earth always, whereas the Transvolvians, who live in the other hemisphere, are unaware of it. Imagine if they were to move to this side. Think of their shock on seeing at night a shining circle 15 times bigger than our moon. They would expect it to fall down on them at any moment, as the ancient Gauls always feared the sky would fall on their head. To say nothing of those who live right on the border between the two hemispheres, seeing Volva always on the point of rising at the horizon. The Jesuit made some ironic and arrogant remarks about the supposed inhabitants of the moon, an old wives' tale, because all celestial bodies do not share the nature of our earth and are therefore not suited to supporting a living population, so it is best to leave those places to the angelic hosts, who can move spiritually in the crystal of the heavens. But how could the heavens be of crystal? If that were so, the comets passing through would shatter them. But who ever told you the comets pass in the ethereal regions? The comets pass in the sublunary region, and here we have air, as you can see for yourself. Nothing moves that is not body. The heavens move, hence they are body. In order to talk nonsensical, you even become Aristotelian. But I know why you say this. You want air to be also in the heavens, then there is no more differentiation between above and below, all turns, and the earth moves its derriere like a strumpet. But we see every night the stars in a different position. Richtig, de facto they move. Wait, I have not finished. You would have the sun and all the stars, which are enormous bodies, make a revolution around the earth every 24 hours, and the fixed stars, or rather, the great ring in which they are set, should travel more than 27,000 times 200 million leagues. For this is what would have to happen if the earth did not make a complete revolution in 24 hours. How can the fixed stars move so fast? Their inhabitants would be dizzy, if they have any inhabitants. But this is petitio principii. And he pointed out that it was easy to invent an argument in favor of the movement of the sun, whereas there were far more arguments against the movement of the earth. I know well, Roberto replied, that Ecclesiastes says, terra autem in aeternum stat, sol orator, and that Joshua stopped the sun and not the earth. But you yourself have taught me that if we take the Bible literally, there would have been light before the creation of the sun. So the holy book must be read with a grain of salt, and even St. Augustine knew that it often speaks more allegorico. Father Casper smiled and reminded him that the Jesuits had long ago given up defeating their adversaries with scriptural cavils. Now they used incontrovertible arguments based on astronomy, on sense, on mathematical and physical reasons. What reasons, ad exemplum? Roberto asked, scraping away a bit of grease from his belly. Ad exemplum, Father Casper replied, irked, with the powerful argument of the wheel. Now you listen me. Think a wheel, all right? I am thinking a wheel. Bravo, so you can also think, instead of being Barbary ape and repeating what you heard in Paris. Now think that this wheel is stuck on a pivot, like it is a potter's wheel, and you want to turn this wheel. What do? I put my hands on it, perhaps just one finger on the rim of the wheel, I move my finger, and the wheel turns. You do not think you had done better to take the pivot, in the center of the wheel, and try to make it turn? No, it would be impossible. So, and your Galileans or Copernicans want to have the sun in the center of the universe fixed and making move all the great circle of the planets around, instead of thinking the movement from the great circle of the heavens comes, while the earth remains still in the center. How could Dominus Deus put the sun in the lowest place in the earth, corruptible and dark, among the luminous and eternal stars? Understand your error? But the sun has to exist at the center of the universe. The bodies in nature need this radical fire, and it must inhabit the heart of the realm to meet the needs of all the parts. Must not the cause of generation be set in the center of everything? Has nature not placed the seed in the genitals, halfway between the head and the feet? And are the seeds not in the center of the apple? And is the pit not in the middle of the peach? And so the earth, which needs the light and heat of that fire, moves around it, to receive the solar virtue in all its parts. It would be ridiculous to believe the sun turns around a point that is of no use to it. It would be like saying, on seeing a roast lark, that to cook it you made the hearth revolve around it. Ah so? Then when the bishop moves around the church to bless it with the thurible, you would have the church revolve around the bishop. The sun can turn because it is of igneous element. And you well know that fire flies and moves and is never still. Have you ever seen the mountains move? Then how does the earth move? The sun's rays, striking it, make it turn, as you can make a ball spin by striking it with your hand, and even by breathing on it if the ball is little. And finally, would you have God make the sun race, when it is 434 times bigger than the earth, only to ripen our cabbages? To give the greatest theatrical emphasis to this last objection, Roberto wanted to point his finger at Father Casper, so he extended his arm and pushed with his foot to make himself good and visible, a bit farther from the side of the ship. In this movement his other hand released its grip, his head moved back, and Roberto finished underwater, unable to make use of the rope, now too slack, to return to the surface, as planned. He then behaved like all threatened with drowning. He made incoordinated movements and swallowed even more water, until Father Casper tautened the rope properly, pulling him back to the ladder. Roberto climbed up, vowing he would never go down there again. Tomorrow you try again. Salt water is like a medicine, do not think it was gross harm, Casper consoled him on deck. And as Roberto made peace with the sea, fishing, Casper explained to him how many and what advantages they would both derive from his arrival on the island. It was not even worth mentioning the recovery of the boat, with which they would be able to move as free men from ship to shore. They would further have access to the Specula Melitensis. From Roberto's report, we must infer that this apparatus exceeded his powers of comprehension, or that Father Casper's account of it, like so many other speeches of his, was made up of ellipses and interjections, as the father spoke now of its form, now of its function, and now of the idea that governed it. And the idea was not even his. He had learned of the specula leafing through the papers of a deceased brother, who in his turn had learned of it from another brother who during a voyage to the most noble island of Malta, or Melita, had heard praise of this instrument constructed by order of the most eminent Prince Johannes Paulus Lascaris, Grand Master of the famous knights. What the specula was like, no one had ever seen. The first brother left only a booklet of sketches and notes, which for that matter had now disappeared. And, on the other hand, Casper complained, that same opuscule was brevissimamente scripto, con nullo schemate visualiter patefacto, null tabule nec rotul, und nulla specialis instruction. On the basis of that meager information Father Casper, in the course of the long voyage on the Daphne, setting the ship's carpenters to work, had redesigned or else misconstructed the various elements of the technasma, mounting them then on the island and measuring, in situ, its countless virtues, and the specula must truly have been an ars magna in flesh and blood, or, rather, in wood, iron, canvas, and other substances, a kind of megahorologium, an animated book capable of revealing all the mysteries of the universe. It was, Father Casper said, his eyes glowing like carbuncles, a unique syntagma of novissimi instrumenti physici et mathematici, in rotas and cycles artfully disposed. Then he drew on the deck or in the air with his finger, and bade Roberto to think of a circular first element, a kind of base or foundation which showed the immobile horizon, with the rhomb of the 32 winds and all the ars navigatoria with forecasts of every storm. For the median section, he then added, built on this foundation, imagine a cube with 5 sides. Can you imagine? Nine, not 6, the 6th rests on the foundation so you do not see him. In the first side of the cube, id est the chronoscopium universalis. You can see 8 wheels arranged in perennial cycles represent the calendars of Julius and of Gregory, and when recur the Sundays and the epochs, and the solar circle, and the movable and paschal feasts, and novalunes and plenilunes, quadratures of the sun and moon. In the secundum cubilatire, id est dos cosmographicum speculum, in primo loco occurs a horoscopium with which given the hour of Melita present, what hour it is in the rest of our globe can be found. And you see a wheel with 2 planispheres. One displays and teaches all the scientia of the primum mobile, and the second the doctrine of the octava sphera and the fixed stars and motion. And the fluxo et refluxo, quid est decrease and increase of the seas, from the movement of the moon stirred in all the universe. This second was the most thrilling side. Thanks to it the observer could know that horologium catholicum mentioned before, with the hour at the Jesuit missions on every meridian, and further, it could also perform the functions of a good astrolabe, in that it revealed as well the quantity of the days and the nights, the height of the sun, the umbri rectae et versae, the altitude of the stars above the horizon, the quantity of crepuscules, the culmination of the fixed stars by year, month, and day. And it was through repeated experimentation here that Father Casper had arrived at the certitude finally of being on the antipodal meridian. There was then a third side that contained in 7 united wheels all astrology, all the future eclipses of the sun and moon, all the zodiacal figures for the times of agriculture, medicine, and the art of navigation, along with the 12 signs of the celestial houses, and the physiognomy of the natural things that depend from each sign, and the corresponding house. I lack the courage to summarize all of Roberto's summary, so I will only mention the 4th side, which supposedly expounded all the wonders of botanical medicine, spagyrical, chemical, and hermetical, with simple and compound medicines derived from mineral or animal substances, and the alexipharmaca, attractive, lenitive, purgative, mollificative, digestive, corrosive, conglutinative, apparative, calefactive, and frigidative, mundificative, attenuative, incisive, soperative, diuretic, narcotic, caustic, and comfortative. I cannot explain what was on the 5th side, that is, the roof of the cube parallel to the line of the horizon, which was apparently arranged like a heavenly vault. But there is mention also of a pyramid, whose base could not have coincided with the cubes, otherwise it would have covered the 5th side. More likely, it covered the whole cube like a tent, but then it would have to be of transparent material. It is certain that the pyramid's 4 faces were meant to represent the 4 regions of the world, and the alphabets for each of them in the languages of the various peoples, including elements of the primitive Adamic language, the hieroglyphics of the Egyptians, and the characters of the Chinese and the Mexicans. Father Casper describes it as a Sphinx mystagoga, an Oedipus aegyptiacus, a monad hieroglyphica, a clavis convenientia linguarum, a theatrum cosmographicum historicum, a silva silvarum of every alphabet natural and artificial, an architectura curiosa nova, a combinatory lamp, mensa isiaca, metametricon, synopsis anthropoglotogonica, basilica cryptographica, an amphitheatrum sapientiae, cryptomenesis patefacta, catoptron polygraphicum, a gazophalacium verborum, a mysterium artis steganographicae, area arithmologica, archetypon polyglotta, an isagoge horopolinea, congestorium artificiae memoriae, pandametron de furtivus literarum nodis, mercurius redivivus, and an etymologicon lustgartline. The fact that all this learning was fated to remain their private appanage, condemned as they were never again to find their way home, did not bother the Jesuit, either because of his faith in Providence or because of his love of knowledge as an end unto itself. But what strikes me at this point is that Roberto, too, could not conceive a single realistic thought, and he was beginning to consider his landing on the island as the event that would give meaning, forever, to his life. In the first place, though he cared little about the specula, he was overcome by the thought that this oracle could tell him where the lady was and what she was doing at that moment. Proof that to a lover, even one distracted by useful corporal exercises, it is futile to speak of sidereal nuncios, for he seeks always and only news of his beautiful suffering and his dear grief. Further, whatever his swimming master may have said to him, he dreamed of an island that did not loom before him in the present, where he also was, but instead by divine decree rested in the unreality, or the non-being, of the day before. What he thought of as he challenged the waves was the hope of reaching an island that had been yesterday, and of which the symbol seemed to him the orange dove, beyond any capture, as if it had fled into the past. Roberto was still driven by obscure concepts. He sensed he wanted something that was not Father Casper's goal, but he was not yet sure what it was. And his uncertainty must be understood, because he was the first man in human history to be offered the possibility of swimming 24 hours into the past. In any case, he was convinced that he really had to learn to swim, and we all know that a single firm motive helps vanquish many fears. Hence we find him trying again the next day. In this phase, Father Casper explained, Roberto should let go of the ladder and move his hands freely, as if following the rhythm of a band of musicians, and impart a lazy motion to his legs. The sea then would support him. The Jesuit induced him to try first with the rope taut, then he slackened the rope without saying anything, or, rather, announced what he had done only when his pupil gained confidence. True, Roberto, at that announcement, immediately felt himself sink, but as he shouted, he kicked his legs instinctively, and found himself again with his head in the air. These attempts lasted a good half-hour, and Roberto realized that he could keep himself afloat. But as soon as he tried to move with greater exuberance, he flung his head back. Father Casper encouraged him to follow that inclination and let himself go, with his head thrown back as far as possible, the body rigid and slightly arched, arms and legs extended as if he lay on the circumference of a circle. Then he would feel himself supported as if by a hammock, and he could remain there for hours and hours, even sleep, kissed by the waves and by the slanting rays of the setting sun. How did Father Casper know all this, never having swum himself? Through Theoria Physico-Hydrostatica, he said. It was not easy to find the proper position. Roberto risked strangling himself with the rope, belching and sneezing. But apparently at a certain point he found his equilibrium. For the first time Roberto felt the sea as a friend. Following Father Casper's instructions, he also began moving his arms and legs. He slowly raised his head, threw it back, became accustomed to having water in his ears, tolerated its pressure. He could even talk, shouting to be heard up on deck. If now you wish, you turn over, at a certain point Casper told him. You lower the right arm, as if it hangs onto your body, you lift slightly your left shoulder, and eke you have belly down. He did not specify that in the course of this maneuver Roberto should hold his breath, since he would find himself with his face in the water, and in a water that wants nothing more than to invade the nostrils of the intruder. So, out of ignoratio elenchi on Father Casper's part, Roberto drank another pitcher's worth of brine. But by now he had learned how to learn. 2 or 3 times he tried turning over, and he grasped a principle, indispensable to every swimmer, namely, when you have your head in the water, you must not breathe, not even with your nose. Indeed you must snort hard, as if to expel from the lungs even the little bit of air that you need so badly. Which seems an intuitive thing, and yet it is not, as this story makes clear. He had further realized that it was easier for him to lie supine, face in the air, than prone. To me the opposite seems true, but Roberto had learned that way first, and for a day or two he continued in that attitude. Meanwhile he dialogued on the maximum systems. He and the Jesuit had resumed their debate about the movement of the earth, and Father Casper had engaged him in the argument of the eclipses. Removing the earth from the center of the world and putting the sun in its place, you must set the earth either below the moon or above the moon. If you put it below, there can never be an eclipse of the sun, because the moon, being above the sun or above the earth, can never come between them. If you put it above, there can never be an eclipse of the moon, because the earth, being above it, can never be interposed between it and the sun. And further, astronomy could no longer predict eclipses, as it has always done so well, because it bases its calculations on the movements of the sun, and if the sun does not move, the exercise would be in vain. Roberto should consider also the argument of the archer. If the earth were to turn every 24 hours, then an arrow, when shot straight up, would fall to the west many miles from the archer. Similar is the argument of the tower. If you dropped a weight from the western side of a tower, it would land not at the foot of the edifice but much farther on, for it would fall not vertically but diagonally, because in the meantime the tower, with the earth, would have moved eastwards. But as everyone knows from experience, a weight falls perpendicularly, and so terrestrial motion is proved to be nonsense. Not to mention the argument of the birds, which, if the earth turned in the space of a day, would never be able to keep up with it, however indefatigable they might be. Whereas we can see clearly that if we travel, even on horseback, in the direction of the sun, any bird can overtake and pass us. Very well, I do not know the answer to your arguments. But I have heard it said that if the earth turns and all the planets, and the sun stands still, many phenomena are explained, whereas Ptolemy had to invent epicycles and deference and all sorts of other stupidities that do not exist on earth or in heaven. I pardon you, if you wanted to make a wits. But if you speak serious, then I say you are pagan as Ptolemy, and I know well he had many mistakes made. So I believe the great Tycho of Uraniborg a very correct idea had. He thought that all the planets we know, namely Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Mercurius, and Saturnus revolve around the Sun. But the Sun revolves with them around the Earth. The Moon around the Earth revolves. The Earth unmoving stands in the center of the circle of the fixed stars. So you explain the mistakes of Ptolemy and say no heresies, whereas Ptolemy made mistakes and Galilei heresies spoke. And you are not obliged to explain how Earth, so heavy as it is, goes roaming around the sky. And how do the Sun and the fixed stars manage? You say they're heavy. I say not. They are celestial bodies, not sublunary. Earth, yes, that is heavy. Then how does a ship bearing 100 cannons sail around on the sea? The sea pulls it, and the wind pushes. In that case, if it is a matter of saying new things without irritating the cardinals of Rome, I have heard of a philosopher in Paris who says that the heavens are liquid matter, like a sea, which circulates everywhere, forming something like whirlpools. Tourbillons. What are they? Vortices. So. Vortices, yeah. But what do these vortices do? This. The vortices pull the planets in their revolution, and a vortex draws the Earth around the Sun, but it is the vortex that moves. The Earth remains immobile in the vortex that pulls it. Bravo, Signor Roberto. You would not allow that the heavens are of crystal, because you were afraid the comets would break them, but you like them to be liquid, so the birds inside them drown. Further, this idea of vortices explains that the Earth turns around the Sun, but does not turn on itself as a child's top spins. Yes, but that philosopher said also that in this case it is the surface of the seas and the superficial crust of our globe that revolve, while the deep core remains still. I think. More stupid than ever. Where did this gentleman write this? I do not know. I think he gave up the idea of writing it, or of publishing it in a book. He did not want to irritate the Jesuits, whom he loves very much. Then I prefer Signor Galilei, who had heretical thoughts but confessed them to very loving cardinals, and nobody burned him. I do not like this other gentleman who has thoughts even more heretical and does not confess, not even to Jesuits his friends. Perhaps one day God will Galilei forgive, but not your friend. Anyway, it seems to me he revised that first idea. Apparently all the accumulation of matter that goes from the Sun to the fixed stars turns in a great circle, borne by this wind. But did you not say the heavens were liquid? Perhaps not. Perhaps they are a great wind. You see? You do not know even. Well, this wind makes all the planets turn around the Sun, and at the same time it makes the Sun turn around itself. So there is a minor vortex that makes the Moon move around the Earth and the Earth turn in place. And yet it cannot be said the Earth moves, because what moves is the wind. In the same way, if I were sleeping on the Daphne, and the Daphne went towards that island to the west, I would move from one place to another, and yet no one could say that my body has moved. And as far as daily movement is concerned, it is as if I were seated on a great potter's wheel that moves, and surely you would first see my face, then my back, but it would not be I that moved, it would be the wheel. This is the hypothesis of a malicious who wants to be heretic but not seen one. But you tell me now, where are the stars? All of Ursa Major, and Perseus. Do they turn in the same vortex? Why, all the stars we see are so many suns, and each is at the center of its own vortex, and all the universe is a great circle of vortices with infinite suns and infinite planets, even beyond what our eye sees, and each with its own inhabitants. Now I have got you and your hereticissimi friends. This is what you want, infinite worlds. Surely you will allow me at least more than one. Otherwise where would God have set hell? Not in the bowels of the earth. Why not in the bowels of the earth? Because, and here Roberto was repeating in a very approximate fashion an argument he had heard in Paris, nor could he guarantee the precision of his calculations. The diameter of the center of the earth measures 200 Italian miles, and if we cube that, we have 8 million miles. Considering that one Italian mile contains 240,000 English feet, and since the Lord must have allowed to each of the damned at least 6 feet, hell could contain only 40 million damned, which seems few to me, considering all the sinners who have lived in this world of ours from Adam until now. That would be true, Caspar replied, not even deigning to go over the calculation, if the damned were inside their bodies. But this is only after the resurrection of the flesh and the last judgment. And then there will no longer be either earth or planets, but other heavens and other earths. Agreed. If the damned are only spirits, there will be 1,000 million even on the head of a pin. But there are stars we cannot see with the naked eye, and instead are seen with your spyglass. Well, can you not think of a glass 100 times more powerful which will allow you to see other stars, and then 1,000 times more powerful which will allow you to see stars even more distant, and so on ad infinitum? Would you set a limit to creation? The Bible does not speak of this. The Bible does not speak of Jove, either, and yet you were looking at it the other evening with that damned glass of yours. But Roberto already knew what the Jesuits' real objection would be. Like that of the Abbé on that evening of the duel when Saint Savin provoked him. If there are infinite worlds, the redemption can no longer have any meaning, and we are obliged either to imagine infinite Calvaries or to look on our terrestrial flowerbed as a privileged spot of the cosmos, on which God permitted his Son to descend and free us from sin, while the other worlds were not granted this grace, to the discredit of his infinite goodness. And, in fact, this was the response of Father Caspar, which allowed Roberto to attack. When did the sin of Adam take place? My brothers have perfect calculations mathematically made, on the basis of the scripture. Adam sinned 3,984 years before the coming of our Lord. Well, perhaps you do not know that travelers who arrived in China, including many brothers of yours, found lists of the monarchs and dynasties of the Chinese, from which it can be determined that the kingdom of China existed more than 6,000 years ago, hence before Adam's fall, and if this is true of China, who knows for how many other peoples it may also be true. Therefore the sin of Adam, and the redemption of the Hebrews, and the great truths of our Holy Roman Church deriving from them, affect only one part of humanity, since there is another part of the human race that was not touched by original sin. This does not in any way affect the infinite goodness of God, who behaved towards the Adamites like the father in the parable of the prodigal son, sacrificing his only son for them. But just as the fact that the father of the parable sacrificed the fatted calf for his son the sinner does not mean he loved his good and virtuous children any less, so our Creator loves the Chinese and any others born before Adam, and is happy that they did not incur original sin. If this happened on Earth, why should it not have happened also on the stars? Who told you this pack of bullshies? Father Casper shouted in a fury. Many speak of it, and an Arab sage said it could be deduced from a page of the Koran. You say me the Koran proved the truth of a thing? Oh, God omnipotence, I implore thee strike down this vain, windy, bloated, arrogant, turbulent, rebellious beast of a man, the demon, dog, devil, cursed infected hound, let him not set foot on this ship. And Father Casper lifted and snapped the rope like a whip, first striking Roberto on the face, then letting go of the line. Roberto fell back with his head down, groped and gasped, could not pull the rope hard enough to tauten it, cried for help as he swallowed water, and Father Casper shouted to him that he wanted to see him give up the Geist and choke to death so he would sink straight to hell as befitted the ill-born of his race. Then, since the Jesuit was a Christian soul, when he considered Roberto sufficiently punished, he pulled him up. And for that day both the lesson in swimming and that in astronomy came to an end, and the two went off to sleep, each in his own direction, without exchanging a word. They made peace the next day. Roberto admitted that he did not believe in this vortex hypothesis, and considered, rather, that the infinite worlds were an effect of an eddying of atoms in the void, and that this did not in any way exclude the possibility of a provident divinity commanding these atoms and organizing them in accord with his decrees, as Roberto had learned from the canon of Digne. Father Casper, however, rejected this idea also, which required a void in which atoms could move, and Roberto had no desire to argue further with this generous generalizer who, rather than sever the cord that kept him alive, gave it all too much play. After receiving a promise there would be no more threats of death, Roberto resumed his swimming experiments. Father Casper tried to persuade him to move in the water, as this is the fundamental principle of the art of natation, and he suggested slow movements of the hands and the legs, but Roberto preferred to lie idle, floating. Father Casper allowed him to linger, and exploited this inaction to rehearse his other arguments against the movement of the earth. In premise, the argument of the sun, which, if it remained motionless and we were to look at it precisely at noon from the center of a room through a window, and the earth turned with the supposed velocity, and it would require a great velocity to make a complete revolution in 24 hours, then in an instant the sun would vanish from our sight. The argument of hail followed. It falls sometimes for a whole hour, but, whether the clouds go to east or west, north or south, it never covers the countryside for more than 20 or 30 miles. But if the earth revolved, and the hail clouds were carried by the wind in its course, hail would necessarily fall over at least 300 or 400 miles of countryside. Then there was the argument of white clouds, which drift through the air when the weather is calm, and seem always to proceed with equal slowness. Whereas, if the earth revolves, those that go westward should advance at immense speed. He concluded with the argument of terrestrial animals, which by instinct should always move towards the east, to comply with the movement of the earth that is their master, and they should show great aversion to westward movement, sensing that this movement is against nature. Roberto accepted all these arguments for a little while, but then he took a dislike to them, and opposed all that learning with his own argument of desire. But finally, he said to the Jesuit, "Do not deprive me of the joy of thinking that I could rise in flight and see in 24 hours the earth revolve beneath me, and I would see so many different faces pass by, white, black, yellow, olive, with caps or with turbans, and cities with spires now pointed, now round, with the cross and with the crescent, and cities with porcelain towers and lands of bells, and the Iroquois preparing to eat alive a prisoner of war, and the women of the land of Tesso busy painting their lips blue to please the ugliest men of the planet, and those of Camel, whose husbands pass them to the first newcomer, as Messer Milioni tells in his book. You see, as I say, when you in the tavern think of your philosophy, it is always thoughts of lust. And if you did not these thoughts have, you could this voyage make if God granted you the gratia to revolve yourself around the earth, which is a gratia as gross as leaving you in the sky suspended." Roberto was unconvinced, but he could think of no further rebuttal. Then he took a longer way, setting out from arguments he had heard, which similarly did not seem to him in conflict with the idea of a provident God, and he asked Casper if he agreed in considering nature a grand theater, where we see only what the author has put on stage. From our seat we do not see the theater as it really is. The decorations and the machines have been set up to make a fine effect from a distance, whereas the wheels and the counterweights that produce the transformations have been hidden from our view. And yet if in the stalls there was a man practiced in the art, he could guess how a mechanical bird could suddenly be made to fly up. So should the philosopher think when faced by the spectacle of the universe. To be sure, The difficulty for the philosopher is greater, because in nature the ropes of the machines are hidden so well that for a long time everyone wondered who operated them. And yet, even in this theater of ours, if Phaeton rises towards the sun, it is because a rope pulls him and a counterweight descends. Ergo, in the end, Roberto was confident, rediscovering the reason why he had initiated this divagation. The stage shows us the sun revolving, but the nature of the machine is quite different, nor can we be aware of it at the outset. We see the spectacle but not the winch that makes Phoebus move, for indeed we live on the wheel of that winch. But here Roberto became lost, because if the metaphor of the winch was accepted, then that of the theater was lost, and all his reasoning became so pointu, as Saint Savin would have said, that it was pointless. Father Casper replied that to make a machine sing it was necessary to shape wood or metal and arrange holes, or attach strings and scrape them with bows, or even, as he had done on the Daphne, invent a water device. But if we opened the throat of a nightingale, we saw no machine of this sort there, a sign that God followed paths different from ours. Then he asked if, as Roberto looked with such favor on infinite solar systems revolving in the sky, he could not admit that each of these systems might be part of a larger system that revolved in its turn within a system still larger, and so on. For, proceeding from such premises, you became like the virgin prey of a seducer. She grants him first a small concession but soon will have to grant him more, and once embarked on that road, she might arrive at any terrible extremity. Of course, Roberto said, one can conceive anything. Vortices without planets, vortices that bump into one another, vortices that are not round but hexagonal, so that each face or side fits into another vortex, all of them together forming a kind of hive with its cells, or else they are polygons that, pressed one against the other, create voids that nature fills with other, lesser vortices, all cogged among themselves like the works of a clock. Their entirety moving in the universal sky like a great wheel that turns and propels inside itself other wheels that turn, each with smaller wheels turning within, and all that great circle making in the sky an immense revolution that lasts millennia, perhaps around another vortex or vortices of vortices. At which point Roberto risked drowning, because of the great vertigo that overwhelmed him. And it was at this moment that Father Casper had his triumph. Then, he explained, if the earth revolves around the sun, but the sun revolves around something else, and omitting the question of whether this something else revolves around a something else of yet another something else, we have the problem of the roulette, of which Roberto must have heard talk in Paris, since from Paris it went into Italy among the Galileans, who would think up anything provided they could disturb the world. What is the roulette? Roberto asked. You can call it also trochoid or cycloid, but it is much the same. Imagine a wheel. Like before? No, now imagine you the wheel of a wagon. And imagine on the rim of the wheel a nail. Now imagine the wheel not moving, and the nail just above ground. Now you think that the wagon moves and the wheel turns. What to the nail happens? Well, if the wheel turns, at a certain point the nail will be on top, but when the wheel has made its complete revolution, the nail is again close to the ground. So you think this wheel has like a circle moved? Why, yes. Certainly not like a square. Now you listen, booby. You say the nail finds itself on the ground where it before was? Wait a moment. No, if the wagon went forward, the nail would be on the same ground, but much farther ahead. Therefore it has not made circular movement. No, by all the saints in paradise. You must not say by all saints off paradise. Forgive me, but what movement has it made? It has made a trochoid, and for you to understand I say it is like the movement of a ball you throw before you, then it touches ground, then makes another arc of circle, then again. But, while the ball makes smaller and smaller arcs, the nail makes always regular arcs, if the wheel always at the same speed goes. And what does this mean? Roberto asked, anticipating his defeat. This means you would have so many vortices in infinite worlds, and that the earth turns, and here your earth turns no more, but goes through the infinite sky like a ball. Tumph tumph tumph. Ack. What a fine movement for this most noble planet. And if your vortex theory got east, all heavenly bodies would go tumph tumph tumph. Now let me laugh, for this is finally the most gross amusement of mine Leben.